This is your communication podcast with Teresa. And for the last section, we are going to discuss forms of persuasion, actually one of my favorite topics in this entire module. And you can see on the slides that there are 8 different types of persuasion that we want to discuss.
Oh yeah!
Please always keep in mind that persuasion is actually quite an ethical way to convince people, because people have the choice. There is voluntary compliance instead of you forcing anybody. And some of these forms that we're discussing today are maybe not so ethical. Sometimes it also has to do with the kind of context that persuasion takes place, where we would maybe use a different word instead of persuasion. For example, in politics, I'm sure you've heard about the word propaganda, and in the religious sphere, we also talk about promulgation of a faith. So these are just different ways of looking at persuasion in different contexts and with different degrees of ethicality.
Oh yeah!
Let's start off with our sanctions. I am sure you've heard the word in the context of international affairs and political affairs, because South Africa used to have sanctions put on itself during the apartheid era. The sanctions basically are punishments and rewards, and because we were living in such an oppressive system, other countries actually said, we will not support this, and therefore we will punish you by excluding you from trade agreements and excluding you from sports activities and tournaments. Parents usually use punishment and reward in order to raise their kids and make these little monsters into somewhat adapted human beings that are able to work in society. So sanctions, punishment, and reward.
Oh yeah!
The second form of persuasion is probably the most ethical type of persuasion, and it's also the type of persuasion where you have the biggest buy-in. You are the most convinced of what has just happened, and that's education. I mean, just put yourself into the situation where you are reading up on skin cancer, for lack of a better example, and you find out that skin cancer is very avoidable by using sunscreen and just limiting your time in the sun. Okay, so you've educated yourself, which then leads to intrapersonal persuasion, where you're telling yourself, based on the facts that I know, I will be motivated to actually be more diligent with my sunscreen. Also, guys, it's very important for you to know that education in general, knowing a lot, can keep you from being unethically persuaded, because you can look through propaganda techniques or promulgation techniques or indoctrination techniques. So education is a great way to persuade yourself, and it's always better to know more.
Oh yeah!
Seduction. I usually have a little bit of a conversation with my students about seduction and whether they think it's ethical or not ethical. What does it say here? It says that persuaders use bribery in order to get you to do something. Well, that doesn't sound so nice. But, of course, in a romantic relationship, seduction can be something quite nice. And it has to do with persuasion as well. They are concentrating here on the advertising market and on the PR market, getting you or seducing you to buy something, to buy products. Sales would seduce us to buy. 2-for-1 would seduce us to buy. And I actually think that's where the negative connotation or the negative undertone comes from.
Oh yeah!
Psychological warfare is your fourth form of persuasion. In this case, the persuader is trying to wage a war by psychological means, not talking about actual guns here or cannons or anything like that. We are manipulating the person, or better to say an opposing group, because we now have to elevate it from an individual basis to a group basis. Think back to 9/11. 9/11 was a great example of psychological warfare. I understand there were still planes that flew into buildings, but it was a demonstrative act that should make the Western world doubt capitalism. And of course, once your opponent doubts their ways, it's going to weaken their morale.
Oh yeah!
Indoctrination indoctrination is a term that is rather often used when it comes to child rearing as well as religious circles. So basically what you're doing when you're indoctrinating is you are repeating messages toward a persuadee without providing a wider context, without actually allowing contrasting messages. So you are repeating one message and not giving the persuadee the chance to see or hear other messages. One could say, kids are being indoctrinated by their parents because, of course, if the parents are, let's say, Amish, they're not going to introduce their kids to a different way of life, and they will constantly feed them with the messages of the Amish.
Oh yeah.
Manipulation is a word that is very often used, but very few people actually know what is behind it. When you're manipulating, you actually throwing your weight around. You know that you are maybe in a higher power position than the person that you are manipulating. And you are using this higher level of power to your advantage. And they also talk here about devious way to change a situation. Don't always think about differences in power in terms of a professional power. In romantic relationships, there's also usually a difference in power. And I'm sure you've heard somebody say, oh, he loves her more than she loves him. Well, if he loves her more, she is in a more powerful position, and she could say something like, if you love me, you would take me on this holiday. That is manipulation, and in this case, the female is exploiting her being wanted more than her wanting her partner.
Oh yeah.
Blackmail is manipulation taken a one step too far. You know the quintessential blackmail scenario. Somebody has something against you, they're holding information about you, they're holding pictures of you, and now they're asserting pressure that you do the things that they say you should do. Now, you can already hear it. When you're blackmailing somebody, you get somebody to change their behavior, but of course there will be no attitudinal buy-in, there will be no psychological conviction to go for something.
Oh yeah.
The last form of persuasion, which we will actually spend an entire unit on, is propaganda. For now, just know propaganda has to do with political persuasion that happens on a mass scale. I know it has a very negative connotation, but actually propaganda is just advertising in a different context. There are many tactics and techniques that politicians use in order to get you to vote for them, or that parties use for you to look at them in a more positive light. We'll discuss all of that, but for now, you have your 8 different types of persuasion: propaganda, blackmail, manipulation, indoctrination, sanctions, education, seduction, and psychological warfare. I would encourage you to find your own original examples to showcase what these forms are all about. I hope you enjoyed it, Schnookies. Until next time, bye!